what I'm proposing, or at least my particular version of what I'm proposing, uh, might not work for everyone. I'm hoping actually that what I'm proposing not only will work for everyone, but I think people will recognize that it's something that they've tried to do occasionally. I'm trying to make that sort of set of good habits, which I believe is kind of hidden and maybe interrupted or constrained by a lot of what people have to do, or the tools they have to use, or their view of the tools they have to use, or what they've been taught about the tools that they have to use, or what they've seen other people do with the tools that they have to use. That those things are kind of interfering with something important that we have to do if we're going to make something that meets all the criteria that I've been talking about. That is, code that is comfortable, uh, flexible, changeable, um, made of some sort of elements which are in some way composable, which in some ways elucidate ideas that we have that are recognizable, but they're not necessarily only what we might call code level ideas, or what you might often find in design patterns type of ideas, but actually are larger ideas about the structure of the user experience, the structure of the programmer's experience, the structure of the 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 large scale and the higher level, intermediate level, and kinds of structures and operations and processes that we generally kind of call high level architecture, but also we call sort of elements of the user experience, and also goals that we have, things that we say in our native language, in our natural language, when we are describing something in a requirements document, for example, or when we're making a mock-up of something and someone is sort of waving their hands about what it is that they want to see happen. So the kind of level of comfort that we have when we're describing these things, so I can say, hey, I want to make a this with a that with a that, um, I would like to be able to really use that same terminology as the central essential description, or central description at the top of my program, and change it if that changes, and have the structures that are below it support that, and actually in some sense reflect that, and in some sense also continue to be modified by the central set of ideas, so that as we produce more kinds of ways of composing things, more kinds of features, more kinds of ideas about what features are, and what kind of categories they fit into, that when we actually make code that implements those things, they get, how should we say, refined by this notion that they will have to be described at a higher level, that they will have to be incorporated in this kind of element and compositional meaning uh, set of explanations, which uh, precede, or at least drive the code that we're writing to actually get it to happen. So this, my particular version of it, to go back to where we started, my particular version of this may not impress people. You're used to particular tools. I'm trying to actually do it in with as few libraries as possible, with as few extras, even to a certain degree with as few obscure features as possible of the tools that I am using, making of other people's tools that I am using to make this happen. And so I want to describe a little bit about what that might look like before I don't know, release this, or at least describe it in more detail, which I'll do later so in a different video. But in any case, um, I want to have a human readable, comfortable, high level description that can be changed, but is human readable and machine readable. It's the basis of our operations, or else, in a sense, we haven't created a human as programmer and you know, tool and machine created by other humans interface. We need to do that. We need to have descriptions that are not just something that is a puzzle you could figure out, but something that actually sort of reflects, again, these sort of high level approaches to, and human level approaches, and comfortable level of approaches to describing things, and doing it well, and making that better and better, and more comfortable, as opposed to more and more. I don't know what exactly is happening in the programming world, but it's just our habit to make it more and more obscure. That we don't quite realize how quickly we can get away from something that is clear and explainable and comprehensible, and can very quickly make something that we ourselves will not understand later. Everyone, I think, is aware of that, um, but as we actually do let it get away from us, and for the most part, that's because we're not given the sort of flexibility to rewrite the code. What I'm trying to do is, again, make us something that will facilitate these high-level descriptions by making it something that you will kind of not have to do, and because it won't force you to do it. You will still be able to, make this code that sort of logically fans out and becomes incomprehensible. But you will be able to, though, see how you can make and find general things, because there will be a central description, which is the basis for your starting, every time you're making a change in the program, or adding a feature to the program, or adding a new idea to the program. So, and this sort of elucidation of ideas and clarification of ideas that are explainable and comfortable for human beings, as opposed to just potentially comprehensible, complex theories about programming, um, is that central description is what I call the essence, because the word essence, of course, is a mind internal thing. There's no essence out there in the real world. A table is not it is actually a human mental construction. We make the table to, of course, match our mental construction. But if there weren't any people around, the table wouldn't mean very much. I mean, it might mean something very different to a different animal. It might mean something very different to, fungus. That if you put it out in the forest, it might mean something different to the floodwaters. I mean, that has no necessarily meaning to floodwaters, but in any case, it's a human artifact. It's a human idea. The things that make a table essential are things inside of our heads, and to a certain degree, ideas. Some of those ideas are, compositions of, in some way, of sort of fundamental ideas that are innate, and then some kind of innate compositional um, uh, operation that puts those things together and makes a table or a screwdriver or any number of things like that. So this sort of mental understanding, I should say, or neural understanding, although neurons aren't particularly involved, but in the sense of a cognitive science understanding of the word essential is what I mean. I'm not trying to say it's essential. You can't have a web application without a this. It's not a web application without a that. In reality, it's just, it's our own ideas that we're describing when we're just describing essential things. So in any case, I'll start with this sort of central description, which is this kind of essence, which we will constantly be going back to. And then there's a kind of an engine that takes that and begins to produce things. And of course, when there are events or interrupts in the system, it will go back up to, actually, it'll go back up there, look for the particular bit. This is a little bit like DNA. Look for a particular bit of the essential description that it needs to do the next thing, because we've told it that's the next thing to do. And then at any point when we're then doing that thing, that is the part of the essence that we're working on at the moment, the part of the description that we are reading and interpreting and giving meaning to by turning it into operations in our code. That meaning is also the thing that directs the interpretation of subsequent things. The children, in a sense, of the level at which we're working on. So there's we have a kind of description, and then there's a description sort of leads to another description, and the way that those descriptions are integrated is composition. And so, in a sense, those will be the elements at hand, or the elements under discussion by that processing that's going on of the central description. And that is a composition. In other words, it's not a simple composition like a list, or even like that's just a sequence of words. Okay, so it's a composition of ideas that is dependent up and down on the elements and the thing that the elements are going to be producing. That's not straightforward. Again, the sum is greater. I should say the whole or the result is greater than the sum of the parts. They're just not added together. They're composed. And by composition, generally I mean we have all these words. At least in English, we have, and of course in all other languages, there are these words that describe a kind of composition of the sort that I'm talking about, which is when you take a couple things and you produce a new result, but the way that you produce the new result is a whole process in and of itself. That process is a kind of composition. In other words, you're not composing things by just concatenating them or adding them, although those are simple kinds of compositions. It's more complex than that. You're unpacking things, and you're looking at them, and there are conditions and constraints that determine what the product will be. There may be separate sets of instructions that come in, and actually something has to interpret those things and actually make judgments of some sort, maybe based on more constraints and conditions, etc. So when you're, and we have lots of words in English like this. I was going to say, synthesis is the first one that comes in mind. You take a couple things and you produce a result. If it's processes, it could be synergy. If it can be composition, it can be a integration. Is a very common one. Not integration as in calculus, but integration as in you take a number of different things to create a new thing, such that the new thing is rather different than the two things that you started with, but they were completely dependent on it and on whatever else you brought to the integration operation that you performed. So in any case, the composition in a very general sense, and by the way, this is sort of reflective of, again, what's going on in the human mind. We know we have something like elemental ideas, and they are composed in some very complicated way to produce new ideas. It sometimes could be very simple ways. If I compose the idea of red with a T-shirt, the idea of a T-shirt, then red T-shirt is not terribly complicated. At least it doesn't seem so to us, which makes it a rather natural and simple thing. But there are very complex kinds of ideas that we can produce from by composing in unusual ways, where we have to ask questions of the things that we're composing and of what our goals are and all kinds of other things, our habits and our desires, and those things will produce the new thing. This happens in the human mind whenever we learn a new word. We're not very explicit about it, and it's barely, and dictionaries only give us hints about how that happens. It doesn't actually describe the composition. It describes it well enough so that a human being who has this very complicated, compositional, hardware available to it can understand the new idea. So this is very similar to what we're doing when we're reading a central description. We're decomposing the things that are, the children of the parent central description that we're interpreting. The interpretation of all the children is the composition of the children and whatever's in the parent necessary to produce the new thing, which will be the program. So I'm hoping, in a sense, at least it works for me. This is a little. I'm going to try again at some other point to describe this, and it'll be easier with probably visual aids and this sort of thing. But in any case, that's the way this new sort of central description, essence, and operational meaning in the interpretation of that essence approach will create an engine that allows us to make essential descriptions of things that are human readable and comfortable, and manipulatable in that sense, and flexible, and create operations underneath that facilitate that, and facilitate the increased ease of use and increased power of the system involved. Again, this will be my version, using what I think is a very simple toolkit that everybody already understands, so that if they then want to go and do something similar with their favorite thing, they can do that. I mean, I'm just providing an example on something that I think is useful, and is useful for me personally, and so I think that essential, explanatory, conceptual approach will be clearly, I think, independent of languages and systems that are kind of built on various sets of ideas, object-oriented and functional ideas, and procedural notions, and fourth-generation language kind of notions, and special purpose notations, all those sorts of things, visual languages, visual tools, future tools that involve 3D manipulation, whatever it is. You still will have to do this, and I think in order to make something that is comfortable and useful, and increasingly useful, and also kind of increasingly good, and makes progress really towards a better understanding of what is going on inside our brains when we program, which is, of course, something that is, I believe, is just completely unapproached these days, and there are lots of reasons to approach it that are would very much improve our attitude towards programming, towards building software, towards developing software. Pick the name for what you do. Designing software, designing human interfaces. Pick your designing experiences. Pick your favorite phrase for the work that you do. But I think this will be necessary. Again, this is just a rough preview. I'm going to turn this into a better presentation.